The restaurant was bustling with life. Soft jazz music played in the background, creating a peaceful ambiance. The clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. The waiters moved quickly, attending to well-dressed customers, their uniforms crisp and polished. Each table was set with fine china, the silverware shining under the dim lighting. The smell of freshly prepared food drifted from the kitchen, teasing the senses. This was a place where elegance met excellence, a spot for those who enjoyed the finer things in life. People came here to celebrate, to indulge, to enjoy. The staff had perfected the art of service. Every detail was considered, from the perfectly folded napkins to the wine pairings that seemed to complement every dish. It was a restaurant known for its exclusivity, where only those with the means and the right appearance were welcomed. On any given evening, it was easy to see the contrast between the patrons and the surroundings. The wealthy, dressed in tailored suits and dresses, settled into their seats with the ease of regulars. They seemed out of place in their comfort, as if they belonged in a world that most could only dream of. And yet, they all seemed so at home in this setting. The door to the restaurant swung open, and in walked a man who seemed entirely out of place. His clothes were worn, the fabric faded from years of use. His shoes were scuffed, barely holding together, and his hands were rough, like they'd seen hard work. He looked around, unsure but determined, before he stepped deeper into the restaurant. A few heads turned as the man entered. Some customers lowered their conversations, casting curious glances his way. He didn't seem to notice or care. The noise around him seemed to fade as he walked through the elegant space, his eyes scanning for an empty table. The waiters, accustomed to serving only the well-to-do, didn't know what to make of him. A few customers whispered to each other, their eyes never leaving the man. The poor man walked to a corner, where an empty table waited, tucked away from the main area. He slid into the chair, his movements slow, as if he didn't want to draw too much attention. He folded his hands on the table, his eyes lowered, as though he was trying to blend in. In a place where wealth and status were the measure of one's worth, this man was a stark contrast, but he didn't seem to mind. To him it was just a place where he might finally enjoy a meal in peace. The murmurs in the restaurant grew louder, but he remained still. He wasn't going anywhere, not yet. A few moments passed before a waiter noticed the man sitting alone at the table. His eyes narrowed when he saw the shabby clothes, the worn-out shoes. He stopped, taking a slow breath, as if preparing himself. This wasn't the kind of customer they were used to serving. The waiter straightened his uniform, walked over, and stood beside the table, arms crossed. His face was a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Can I help you, sir?" The tone wasn't welcoming. It was more of a question wrapped in judgment, as if the man didn't belong there. The poor man looked up, meeting the waiter's gaze. "Yes, I'd like to see the menu, please," he said softly, his voice calm but clear. The waiter raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "You want the menu?" He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is a fine dining restaurant. I'm not sure this is the kind of place for you." He glanced down at the man's clothes, his lip curling in disdain. The poor man didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his expression unchanging. "I understand, but I would still like to have a meal." The waiter's frown deepened. He glanced around at the other tables, the wealthy customers, and then back at the man. His patience was clearly wearing thin. "I'm afraid we don't serve people like you," he said, his words cutting, his gaze now sharp and dismissive. For a moment the restaurant seemed to go quiet. All eyes turned toward them, the murmurs of the customers fading as they waited for what would happen next. The poor man looked around the room, his gaze meeting those of the other customers. They all watched in silence, none of them speaking up, none of them intervening. It was as though they expected the same thing to happen, but he didn't react with anger or frustration. Instead he spoke softly, almost apologetically. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, his voice calm, though a hint of sadness lingered beneath the words. "I just want to eat." The waiter shook his head, his patience clearly running out. "I told you we don't serve people like you here. This is a place for those who can afford it, not for—" He stopped himself, catching the words before they could get any harsher. But it didn't matter, the meaning was clear. The man's clothes, his appearance, everything about him marked him as an outsider. Someone who didn't belong in a place like this. The poor man sighed, but didn't argue. He knew it was pointless. "I can pay," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small crumpled bill. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The waiter waved it away dismissively. "We don't take people like you here," he repeated, his tone final. He gestured toward the door, signaling that the conversation was over. There was a brief moment of silence, before the whispers began again. Some of the customers exchanged glances, others looked away, embarrassed, but no one said anything. The poor man slowly stood up, looking around one last time as if hoping someone would step in, but no one did. He turned and began to walk toward the door, head low, his heart heavy with the weight of rejection. As the poor man walked toward the door, the sound of footsteps echoed through the quiet restaurant. His shoulders were slightly slumped, not from defeat, but from the quiet resignation of someone who had expected this. He paused just before reaching the door, his hand rested on the cold handle, but he didn't open it. For a moment, he stood still, taking a breath, as if gathering the courage to say something. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting the waiter's. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet pain behind the words. The waiter stood by the table, arms crossed, watching the man with a look that could have been indifference, or perhaps guilt. He didn't answer, just continued to watch him, as if unsure of what to say next. The poor man's gaze lingered on the waiter for a few seconds before he spoke again, his words a little stronger now. "I understand that I don't look like the kind of customer you're used to, but I just wanted to have a meal. I'm not asking for anything special, just something simple." The restaurant was still silent, the other customers watching with interest, some glancing at each other, but none willing to speak up. The poor man sighed, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of the moment. I guess I don't belong here, but I thought for just a moment I could." He turned back to the door, and gave it one last look. "Thank you for your time," he said quietly, before opening it and stepping outside into the cold night air. The door swung shut behind the poor man, and a silence fell over the restaurant. The whispers that had been swirling around suddenly stopped. The atmosphere once filled with light conversation, now felt heavy, awkward. The customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to do next. The waiter stood by the table, arms still crossed, his gaze fixed on the door where the man had just left, but then, the quiet was broken. From the back of the restaurant, the owner walked into the dining area. He was a middle-aged man, tall and dignified, with a calm presence that seemed to command attention the moment he stepped into the room. His suit was tailored perfectly, his expression calm, but serious. He looked around the room, then his eyes landed on the waiter. "What's going on here?" the owner asked, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of authority. The waiter looked up, startled. "Nothing, just a little misunderstanding," he replied quickly, his voice a little too defensive. The owner raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his gaze now fixed on the waiter, who shifted uncomfortably. The waiter nodded, glancing toward the door where the poor man had just left. "Yes sir, the man just didn't belong here. He was asking for a menu, and I told him this wasn't the place for someone like him." The owner's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "What do you mean someone like him?" he asked, taking a step closer. The waiter hesitated before responding. "His clothes, he didn't look like he could afford the kind of food we serve here. I thought he was just wasting our time." The owner's expression softened, but only for a brief moment. He looked around the restaurant, as if taking in the full weight of what had just happened. Then he turned, his eyes following the poor man's path to the door. "Stay here," he said, his tone now firm, before he walked toward the exit. The owner stepped outside into the crisp night air, his eyes scanning the street. The poor man was a few steps away, walking slowly down the sidewalk, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world on them. The owner didn't hesitate. He quickened his pace, and caught up to the man in just a few moments. He placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder, causing him to stop and turn. "Excuse me, sir," the owner said, his voice surprisingly warm. The poor man looked up, startled, his face a mixture of confusion and weariness. The owner smiled kindly. "I'm sorry for what happened back there. Would you mind coming back inside with me for just a moment?" The poor man glanced back at the restaurant, then at the owner, unsure of what to say. "I don't think I belong in there," he said quietly, his eyes lowered. "I wasn't meant to be there. I don't want to cause any more trouble." "No trouble at all," the owner replied gently. "Please just come with me." After a brief hesitation, the poor man nodded, and the two of them turned back toward the restaurant. As they stepped through the door, the atmosphere inside had shifted. The whispers had stopped, and the room felt oddly still. The waiter, who had been standing by the table, was watching them with wide eyes. The other customers were watching too, some leaning in slightly, curious to see what would happen next. The owner walked the poor man up to the front of the room, and turned to face the waiter. "This man," he began, "is not just anyone, he's someone who owns this place." The waiter blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The owner smiled, his tone firm yet understanding. "He's the one who built this restaurant from the ground up. The one who made it what it is today." A stunned silence filled the room, the waiter's face drained of color, his eyes widening as the realization hit him. He had just rejected the very man who had made this restaurant possible. The waiter stood frozen, his face pale as the truth settled in. His eyes darted between the owner and the man standing in front of him, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. The shock was too much to process. The poor man, who was now revealed to be the owner, stood there quietly, his hands resting calmly at his sides. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of resentment. Instead, there was a quiet sadness, almost as if he was disappointed, but not surprised by what had just happened. The waiter's hands began to tremble, his confidence from earlier now completely shattered. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I'm sorry," the owner held up a hand, cutting him off. "You didn't know, but that doesn't change what happened. You judged a man based on how he looked, not who he was, and in doing so you embarrassed yourself, the restaurant and me." The words were firm but measured. The room was still, the weight of the moment hanging over everyone. The other customers, who had been watching in silence, now looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The waiter dropped his head, his shoulders slumping. He felt the sting of his actions, the weight of his mistake, and the shame that came with it. "I'm so sorry," he said again, his voice small, barely audible. "I didn't mean to, I just..." His words faltered, and he swallowed hard, unable to finish his sentence. The owner sighed, his gaze softening. "You have to understand," he said, looking directly at the waiter, "how easy it is to make assumptions about people. But appearances don't tell the whole story. Never judge someone by what they wear, or how they look. Everyone has a story, and you'll never know it just by looking at them." The waiter nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in deeper than he expected. He was beginning to understand, really understand, the lesson he had just learned the hard way. The owner turned toward the man, the one who had been unjustly dismissed just moments earlier. With a warm smile, he gestured to the table where the poor man had sat. "Please take a seat. The meal is on me." The poor man hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. He walked over to the table and sat down, his posture a bit more relaxed now, though his eyes still carried the weight of the earlier rejection. The owner followed him, pulling out a chair, and sitting across from him. The waiter, meanwhile, stood in the background, his gaze lowered, unsure of what to do next. He felt the sting of his mistake, the embarrassment gnawing at him. The other customers were watching, their eyes filled with curiosity and some discomfort. They had witnessed something they hadn't expected, a lesson in humility that no one could ignore. The owner turned to the waiter. "Bring the man his menu. He's one of us now," he said with a gentle but firm tone. The waiter nodded and, despite the knot in his stomach, walked over to the table, His hands shook slightly, as he placed the menu in front of the poor man, who looked up at him without a word. The waiter swallowed hard, then met the man's gaze. "I apologize," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his regret. "I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry for what I said earlier." The poor man nodded once, accepting the apology without a hint of bitterness. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I understand." His words were simple, but they carried a sense of grace that made the waiter feel even worse for his actions. As the waiter left to give them some space, the owner leaned forward. "You know, I could have said something when you first walked in," he said thoughtfully. "But I wanted to see how you would handle the situation. I wanted to see if you could teach us all something." The poor man smiled softly, his eyes meeting the owner's with understanding. "We all make mistakes," he replied, "but we can always learn from them." And in that moment, the lesson was clear to everyone in the room. It wasn't about money or status, it was about kindness, humility, and treating everyone with respect, no matter what they looked like.